Okay. Oh, okay. Great. Yeah, that would be good because I've seen it a couple of times, once or twice anyway. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
good evening, everybody. This is the September 11th, September 25th, 2019 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. I do have one announcement before we start the agenda items. Item number 6, which is a continuing education video presentation, will now be the last item on the agenda, and I'll make another announcement when we get to that point. So, first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from September 11th, 2019. Do we have any additions, corrections, comments? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve.
I move to approve. This is Wendy.
Second.
Second by Joe. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the minutes are approved. Thank you. Item number 2, public comment. Members of the public may speak to the commission regarding matters not on the agenda tonight or currently pending before planning and zoning. So if you'd like to address the commission, Chuck, would you like to come on up to the table and join us over here? And
look guilty.
no, just introduce yourself if you would, and we would love to hear from you.
Chuck Bond, 66 North Moore Street here in Moscow. I've spoken to the commission 2 or 3 times in the past about a problem that was bothering me considerably. I don't know if the commission had any input on the fact that there is now a fence installed. But I did want to come by and say, 1, thank you for listening to me in the past. I truly appreciate your time. And 2, if you had anything to do with this fence, I truly appreciate that also. I don't know if it is the fence or maybe a increase in the vacancy rate at the neighbors next door, but I have not had a problem with parking yet this year. And this year, last time, it was a disaster. I could have been there 24/7, and I could not have kept up with it. But again, things have changed, and again, thank you for listening to me in the past. And if you had any input in that fence, I appreciate it very much.
I thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think Mike gets the credit for keeping things moving here. So Mike, thank you I know you did a lot of work on the fence and contacting identity and moving that forward. So
yeah, I wish it could have happened sooner, but happy to hear that that kind of resolved for you for the time.
No, thank you very much for your time and effort on that, Mike. Like I said, things are considerably different. Absolutely 180 degrees from last year. And I pull in at 5:30 in the morning, and there's 2, 3, 4 spaces vacant. And last year they were in the handicap spots, the fire spots, and then calling me at midnight because there was no place to park. Yeah. So I do appreciate everybody's time and effort on that very much.
Thank
you very much.
I know it was a difficult issue, and I particularly appreciate you coming tonight and describing to us the resolution, and I'm glad
that's my pleasure. I mean, I'm happy to give praise where it is due, as well as bad tidings. So, but, again, does anyone else have any questions for me at all?
Well, I'm just glad. This is Wendy. I'm just glad to hear that, Chuck, that things have improved. That's great news.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
So.
Super. Okay.
Is there any evidence that the change in occupancy of the?
Just nasty rumors.
Okay.
Nothing I could confirm.
Yeah.
I do have a number of tenants this year that used to rent from Identity.
Interesting.
So but as far as the vacancy rate goes, I couldn't answer that, truthfully anyway.
Okay.
That's great. Any other questions for Chuck? Well, that's great. Thank you so
I'll
much.
get out of your way.
We do
Thank you guys very
appreciate
much.
it. Thanks for joining us, Chuck.
You guys have a good
Appreciate it.
evening.
Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
The third item on the agenda is review of the sign code research. I believe that that was under discussion, at the last meeting? And
yeah, we introduced it at the last meeting, and I think the comment I received was that we'd like to take a look at what other communities did as far as regulating signage as a result of the Supreme Court case, Reed versus the town of Gilbert. So I've just gone through, we had a presentation last time, and I'll start at the very end of that, but I just wanted to briefly go over kind of the makeup of our current sign code, which is, probably comes as no surprise, it's in narrative format. And so this has always been an item that we've been looking forward to addressing as far as putting it into more of a table format. And it's similar to what we had before with the zoning districts and the permitted uses and the conditionally permitted uses. So we go through our kind of 2-column format, but we have, sign regulations based upon zoning district. And there's a lot of duplications because there's freestanding signs, located in numerous zoning districts, but they're duplicated on there. So it'd be much cleaner to put this in more of a table format. And so that's one thing that we'll look at doing with these sign code amendments. But yeah, essentially you go through and it's all based upon zoning district, and it goes through the different types of signage, monument signs, freestanding signs, and it all typically varies depending upon the zone. Most of the residential zones, there's really limited signage there, and then you go to the more intense commercial zones. And there's more of a sliding scale as far as an increase in signage allowances once you go that route. But I was able to find some other jurisdictions kind of in the West that ended up changing their sign codes as a result of the Supreme Court case. But I couldn't find any in Idaho yet. I know that Twin Falls is currently working on theirs. Spokane was probably the closest jurisdiction that I was able to find. And they've, this primarily just deals with a lot of the temporary signs. So we talked a little bit last time about the political signs, the real estate signs, the directional signs. So the kind of the litmus test on this is if you have to read the sign in order to tell what type of sign it is. And so, as a result of the Supreme Court case, a lot of communities are starting to just have a number of signage, but refer to the types of signage not directly but in a roundabout way, and we'll kind of go through what we have. So with Spokane, there's always there's intended to be a statement about kind of commercial and non-commercial purposes. So that's where the kind of freedom of speech comes in, is that you really can't regulate speech anymore. It's a right to free speech, and you can either have non-commercial speech or commercial speech, but you can't really draw a distinction between the two. And so they almost always have some type of statement, and Spokane has theirs here. It talks about, this chapter should not be interpreted to restrict speech on a basis of content, viewpoint, or message. Any classification of sign authorized in this chapter for commercial purposes shall be interpreted to also be permitted for non-commercial purposes. No part of this chapter shall be construed to favor commercial speech over non-commercial speech. To the extent that any provision in this chapter is ambiguous, the term shall be interpreted not to regulate speech on the basis of the content of the message. So it's I think every community does it a little bit differently, but they almost always have this statement in there. And then they've also got a severability clause, which talks about, if there's any portion that's ruled unconstitutional, it doesn't invalidate the rest of the document. And so that's what we have with, a lot of the sign codes, is that there's certain portions that are unconstitutional based upon that Supreme Court case, the ones that deal with content, but the rest of them that just deal with size, number, things like that are still constitutional. So they have a table, and most of these jurisdictions will go to the table format like we're planning on doing. But yeah, this is essentially what it looks like. So you have different uses, different types of. It's usually broken down by zone. So this is residential, single-family duplexes, attached houses. Let you know how many signs are allowed, the maximum sign face area, the types of signs that are allowed, the maximum heights of the signs, and then additional signs may be allowed, in this case directional signs. I think there's other portions that talk about if there's a parking lot and you're directing people to that, you're still able to do those types of signs. And so this would be the standard, probably non-commercial signage. It may be here they restrict it to one per site, and so if you have a political sign, it would cover this. A lot of times, if it was a real estate sign, it'd be covered on here as well, and so it'd just be one per site on private property, 3 square feet in size. And then as you go up with the intensity as far as the use, multifamily housing, it starts to go up as far as the amount of signage that you're allowed on that property.
Question.
Yeah.
You just said political signs. Lots of people have multiple political signs in their yard, so.
I have the same question, Victoria. You know.
Well, yeah, this is just an example of Spokane's, and so,
Uh-huh.
you know, we'll go through, we've got a couple more on here, but some of them don't regulate the number at all. Maybe they'll say that you can only, they're limited to 3 square feet in size, but that's it. You can have however many you want in your yard. Some say that maybe it's, I think the last one is 32 square feet in size, so you can have however many signs as long as they don't exceed the 32 square feet in size for the total sign area for the lot.
So does that
Mike,
mean-
is a timeline, so, I mean, normally we have a timeline with political signs, that they can only be up a certain amount. Is that no longer valid, or under this, can we still limit the time that political signs are allowed, or no?
No, we can't really address, I mean, we can allow, so if we were to say that in this case, we'd allow 1 sign per site, could be the 3 square feet in size, and that could happen year round, so it could be the non-commercial, everybody, everybody's our neighbor type signs, no matter where you come from. That would be a non-commercial sign that would maybe fit that criteria. Maybe you can have 1 in your yard the entire year. And then we define certain time periods. So 60 days prior to the election up to 14 days past an election, then you're allowed a certain amount extra of additional signage on the property. And so, I mean, we could do it that way, or we could just not even, maybe it's just carte blanche, however many signs you want on your property. It's really up to you. So I guess we have a decision.
Well, actually, Wendy, this is Rob. If I remember, state law requires signs in your yard to come down 7 days after the election. So I believe there's already, it's not a city code, I believe it's a state requirement, and then the 60 days prior. So the timing on these other signs may be already coded in
Yeah.
I don't know if that's.
We have it in our city code too,
Yeah, it
where
is,
you gotta
okay.
take them down, but I've seen with other codes that they do make a statement about, these regulations are not intended to trump state and federal other regulations that may come down from the
okay.
state or the feds.
Okay.
And so we could certainly look at adding that.
Sure.
I mean, if they do stipulate that on the state level.
Well, maybe I'm confusing the city code with state, but I thought that there was a pretty strict requirement. 7 days after election, they've got to be out of the yard.
I can look into it.
Okay.
And another thing would be, I don't know that they're always the same as elections if you're doing a bond or a proposition or some of those other things that you vote on that may not be during election period.
Yeah.
But I don't think, the state law talks about at election time, it doesn't give a specific date, does it? I don't think.
I don't know that well, for some reason I have it in the back of my head that it was 7 days after the election that the sign had to be
When do
down.
they have to come down?
But I don't have a citation for that.
Yeah, and would that be national or would that?
I thought it was state. I thought it was state,
Or would
but.
it then apply to city,
But I think it's, well, we'll just have to
Yeah.
research that a little bit, but because I think there's something out there already, because isn't there, you can't do anything, at least the candidates can't do anything until 60 days before election, and that means that they can't distribute signs even, if I remember correctly, so.
Well, if I can interject, Phil has done a lot of sign posting for various candidates over the last few years, and he says that, you know, you're limited to 60 days before the election. Absolutely, you can't do it any sooner than that. That's just for the signs. He wasn't sure if it was set. They always go around and take down the signs pretty much within a day or two after the election, but he wasn't sure if it was 7 or 14 days on that, but on the post end, but. Yeah. And they can't be in the tree lawn, that's the other thing.
Didn't even think about that.
Well, we can,
Yeah, our code says 60 days preceding the first day of the primary election or vote for the office or ballot measure with which it's associated. And every sign has to be removed within 7 days following the day of the final election or vote for the office or ballot measure.
okay, so, great.
So yeah, we have a decision to make as far as, you know, those number of signs and whether or not we draw a distinction with allowing more, or we just, you know, maybe say that it really doesn't matter how many you have on in your yard at any time of year. And then they go through temporary signs, no permit required. So they do not allow temporary signs on city-owned property, which we don't hear. I guess there's the question of city right-of-way. They do, you know, Spokane does allow signs within the city right-of-way. And that'd be a question. I mean, right now we don't really allow signs in the right-of-way except for downtown, or if you're in a commercial zone where you are right up to the sidewalk and you have no, you know, other area in order to display like a sandwich board type sign. And so that's one area where Spokane is fairly liberal as far as their allowance of portable temporary signs in the right-of-way. You know, another issue we have is that we have, you know, in Fort Russell area and the older areas, we have these really large right-of-ways that are 80 feet wide, and so a lot of times the right-of-way, you know, doesn't end and the private property doesn't begin until it could be to your front porch, or halfway to your yard. So that's another kind of thing to take into consideration. But
I think if one were to check, a large portion of the political signs that are posted are probably actually within the city right away.
yeah, they're probably.
Well, and, you know, maybe
And-
right-of-way isn't so much of an issue, you wouldn't want it on city property, but if there wouldn't be any reason not to have it on a right-of-way, I wouldn't think, but I'm not sure.
I'm not quite sure where the city right away ends
Yeah.
in front of my house.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think with those signs, I think of that strip, like between the sidewalk and the road, where there's grass, where,
Tree lawn.
I know that you're not supposed to
Yeah.
put, oh, that's what that's called, tree lawn? Okay.
That, a lot
Yeah.
of placing it is, where is it gonna be visible?
Yeah.
If you've got a hedge and the hedge right there, you're not gonna stick it where the hedge is, you're gonna put it somewhere where it will be seen. My tree lawn, you wouldn't be able to, everybody parks there, you'd never see a sign.
Yeah.
So.
But a lot of the real estate signs end up in the tree lawn as well.
Mhm.
So, so they allow them in the right of way, but it has to meet certain standards. So they don't allow, you know, it has to be entirely outside of the right of way corner between the curb lines created by extending the property line. Then they have a visual here that give you an idea of what that is. So, you know, within the corner area, it's kind of the sight triangle area. You're not allowed any type of temporary portable signage. You would have to put it, you know, elsewhere along the block.
I would say the only, just in observation, the only people that break that law are sale, you know, Saturday sale, yard
yes.
sale signs usually are out pretty much on the sidewalk. And they're back, and they usually only stay up for less than 24 hours. But I would say that Political signs don't seem to show up that way at all, but the yard sale folks, they're racing out and they grab a box and write something on it and throw it on the sidewalk.
Or real estate open house signs.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
see
real
those
estate
in that-
open
in that
house
area as
too,
well.
but that, once again, usually only
Yeah.
lasts for 10 hours or so.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm quite sympathetic to the idea of maintaining the side triangle, though.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Almost no one can have a high sign, except real estate agents sometimes have A-frames, but most common people don't have any signs, so they have it's usually a box. Oh, I seem to be on a corner where I see them often on my corner, but they don't. If they're there for more than 6 or 7 hours, I put them in the trash anyway. So, but most people pick them up.
So this is another visual. You know, a lot of times we have similar regulations as far as sandwich board signs downtown, where you have to maintain a certain clear width. I think it's 6 feet of pedestrian clear zone here. So they have similar regulations where you can put it closer to the street, but you still have to maintain the pedestrian corridor there for people to get by. So then we get to temporary signs placed on property residentially zoned, the following requirements. So we go through single family and multifamily. So single family temporary freestanding signs should not exceed 4 square feet in size, 5 feet in height if the sign is post mounted to the ground, not exceed 3 feet in height if the sign is stake mounted or portable. So and then, yeah, jumping ahead of that, there is a requirement here that, so they allow the temporary signs in the public right of way, but they require permission from the adjacent property owner in order to place those there. So it says temporary signs placed in the right of way must have the permission of such placement of the abutting property owner, resident, respective agent. For purposes of this section, the public right-of-way shall mean the portion of the public right-of-way located next to the street between the roadway and adjacent private property open to the public for general pedestrian passage, including the buffer and the planting strip.
So you can't put a whole bunch of political signs in the right-of-way in front of somebody who's supporting the opposite candidate.
Yeah, so that's what I thought was the problem.
That could
Now
create
you're,
all
now you're
sorts of.
curtailing free speech.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
I think you just let him do it.
Go for it. I don't think we want to go down that.
And then they go through a number of exemptions as far as not being required to get a sign permit, flags, memorial signs, all sorts of government signs. So we have something similar for government signs on behalf of a city, county, federal, state government. But we'll have to probably increase that language a little bit just to be more clear. Signs of public utility companies, flush-mounted wall signs, non-visible signs, changeable signs, repair and maintenance of signs, sculptures, fountains, mosaics, kind of the no trespassing, no dumping, no parking signs, publicly approved non-illuminated interpretive signs, illuminated wall highlights, do not contain words or logos, interior signs, and then temporary signs don't need a permit as long as they comply with the regulations that we just went over. So Gilbert, Arizona, we figured that they would have the ideal code since they're the ones that got sued and all this. So we went through and actually I think they had one of the better ones. Here's their statement about the substitution of non-commercial speech for commercial speech. It's similar to Spokane's paragraph. Just talks about the ability to substitute non-commercial with commercial and vice versa. So long as there's no really change in the size of the sign. Then they go into criteria for temporary signs. And then once again, we go through, the big ones, residential zoning districts. Maximum number of signs per parcel, they allow 4. So this would be the non-commercial speech signs, and then so they have some other heritage zoning districts and gateway zoning districts where they have special requirements. But if you look at this footnote here and then go down at the bottom, I thought this one was probably one of the best as far as addressing the real estate, garage, yard sale, estate sale. So it says in single-family residential zoning districts, each single-family residential use with at least one principal structure may place up to 6 off-site temporary signs on private property for the purpose of directing the public to a residential activity. So examples, real estate, garage, yard sale, estate sale. Said sign should be displayed only during the hours that the single-family residence is open for public inspection and shall not exceed 6 square feet in size per sign. So it's, limiting these year-round, but for those special events where you're inviting the public onto your property, the house is for sale, you have a garage sale, there's an open house, estate sale on the property, you're allowed, additional 6 off-site signs in order to be able to advertise for that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, what did this ruling conclude that there could be no time restriction on how long a sign could be there?
There could be a time, yeah.
There could be a time restriction.
You can have a time, you just can't regulate the content of the sign.
Right,
So you
okay.
can't, you would have to say that you can display this additional signage during this, 60 days in advance of election or 7 days after an election. You're able to display an additional amount of sign, but you can't specifically call it a political sign anymore.
Right. So I guess
So-
where I'm going with that is what does temporary mean? In this table and a lot of this language that other municipalities have come up with, they talk about these rules for temporary signs. What's considered temporary?
Well, they all have definitions, but
Okay.
it's primarily something that's not, permanently mounted to the ground or fixed upon a wall.
Okay.
So those are, they draw a distinction between permanent and temporary signs. And, usually that's the distinction, is that you can readily just go in and pull it up out of the ground or pick it up and move it.
So once you
and
pour
that- and that's a
concrete and put a
temporary-
sign in it, then
That's
it's
a
not
permanent
temporary.
sign.
Okay.
Yeah. So they go through, maximum sign area, sign height, setbacks from right-of-way, we cover that as well. And then more temporary signs, so this is, going through, more residential zoning districts. And then it goes through other requirements, whether or not permits required, spacing between other signs, whether or not you're able to incorporate fluorescent colors, permission of owner required, yes, all across the board. Allowed within site visibility triangle, no. Allowed on public sidewalk right away, no on those. So those would be, I guess that'd be the caveat. They're allowing all this additional off-site signage, but you still can't place it in the right of way. You have to talk to your neighbor to see if they can place that in their yard to advertise your open house or, your yard sale sign. So it just specifies a duration that you have to take it down, and whether or not lighting's allowed or movement's allowed either. So
Mike, back up, the minimum spacing, this 15 feet, I mean, that's kind of unrealistic when you're looking at temporary. There's a lot of places that wouldn't have 15 feet to put 4 signs. I'm probably exaggerating, but is that something that anybody views as an issue that is problematic for? I mean, I wonder why it's even in there.
I think it'd be too much detail. I mean, a lot of these things are way too fine a detail for the regulations. I mean, we always try to judge it on whether or not you have the staff to go out and enforce it. And if you have, a lot of regulations like this that are just seem really kind of ticky-tack, it just sets yourself up for, really an inability to enforce your regulations.
Yeah.
Well,
And-
especially with like political signs, because you have crews of volunteers working for candidates, and they may have an understanding of the general parameters, like not putting signs in the tree lawn, but going out and measuring between signs when there's three different campaigns coming and putting signs up. Sometimes for different I'm thinking of city council right now. You have all these people. But we have 6 candidates and people going around with at least 2 or 3 that they're putting signs up for. It seems too detailed. I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, it's just, what are you trying to achieve? I mean, if you're trying to reduce clutter, are 3 of them kind of grouped together as opposed to 3 15 feet apart? Is that, going to make that big of a difference for the community?
Come and got me when I had
But I like
seven
your
on my
description that sometimes there's just too much detail. You don't
Right.
need it. So
Yeah.
I think to the degree that we can keep it simpler is great.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to imagine a typical political sign that the wire one as a sign, really. It's just something different. 15 feet doesn't even isn't even in the same universe. Now, if you put up a 4x8 political sign, then if you put them closer than 15 feet, you're blocking somebody's view. But these little tiny things, my gosh. And at 32 feet, if you can have 32 square feet, that means you can have 15 of them in your yard. Well, hello. No one has 15.
I think I had 6 in my yard in a recent election.
I've gone up to 6, maybe even 7, but that's only even at 2 feet each, and they're not 2 feet. That's still under the 32.
Yeah.
Victoria, you had something?
Oh, I was just going to say, back to that right-of-way thing, it's different in different neighborhoods. This yard might be one, this yard might be something else. Who's going to ever
No, we're at the
be
right
able
of
to
way.
deal with that? And, well, how come he gets to put it there and I can't?
Yeah.
Different right-of-way.
A lot of people I've talked to have no idea where their
Have no
right-of-way ends.
I don't think I know.
Yeah.
The next one I found was Portland. So they go over, so they have different categories. I thought I just kind of pulled different categories that I thought were interesting as part of Portland's. They do still allow directional signs. Restrict them to 6 square feet in area, 42 inches in height. They're allowed in all zones. They're not counted towards the total square footage. So this is, you're thinking of the signs that we have to account for as far as like the drive-through or parking this way, things like that. And that's the way that, a lot of them are exempt. Right now in our code, they're exempt. But this is the way they deal with them and still exempt them out, is call them directional signs. And they don't count towards the total square footage on the property. And then they have a different term for our temporary political real estate signs. They call them lawn signs. So lawn signs have to meet the standards of this section. They're allowed in all zones and are not counted towards the total square footage of permanent sign allowed on the site. So they can be up to 3 square feet in size. Must be entirely outside of the right of way. Can't be illuminated. And then we've got temporary portable signs, which are undoubtedly different than lawn signs. So they're allowed in all zones, can be 4 square feet in area. Vertical dimension of the sign, including support, can be no more than 24 inches. And they have to be entirely on private property, or they must meet the placement standards of that other sections. Signs extended in the right of way. And then hours of use. So I'm thinking that these are probably, for these hours don't make a whole lot of sense. And this is maybe directed towards the open house. So they're allowed between the hours of 6 p.m. Friday and 8 p.m. Sunday, so pretty much just on the weekends. And the hours of 6 a.m. and 1 p.m. on Tuesdays. I couldn't figure out the Tuesday. You know?
That's part.
First I thought maybe it was an election,
yard
but why
sale
would you
stuff
cut it
for
off
weekends.
at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday? So I'll have to think about that one a little bit more to see if I can figure it out.
Maybe
But-
it's like
Mike, was
flea
that for
market
real
thing.
estate signs you said?
Well, it's a temporary portable sign is what
Oh.
it's called. So they're drawing a distinction between a lawn sign and a temporary portable sign.
I was thinking it might be A-frame signs.
Well, they have, and they do have, so they have portable signs, which are more of the A-frame,
Yeah.
but now they have temporary portable signs. Which, seems like way too many categories, first of
Right.
all. But, yeah, it's just interesting the hours of use and how that came in odd like that. Yeah, so now you go to the portable signs, so they can be in the right of way as long as it's entirely outside of the roadway. Can't be larger than 8 square feet in size. It needs to be outside of that corner that we looked at before with the city of Spokane. Has to be entirely outside of the area of the sidewalk. Can't be within 6 inches of the curb, and it can't obstruct continuous pedestrian zone or wheelchair access. So this is fairly similar to what Spokane did. So one of the two, I think, ended up copying the language from the other. And then we go through physical attachment to the public property. Portable signs placed in the right-of-way must remain portable, may not be attached, anchored. So this is more or less just more A-frame, sandwich board type signs. And then it goes through additional placement standards for temporary portable signs. And so we're going back to the temporary ones here. Temporary placed in the right-of-way must meet the following additional standards. Where no curb exists, sign must be placed outside the roadway, 5 feet from the edge of the road. Can't be placed in medians, traffic islands, other areas of the roadway. Temporary portable signs must not be placed in parking spaces, pedestrian pathways, or bicycle paths. And if the sidewalk's less than 8 feet in width, they may not be placed on the sidewalk. And then they go through kind of a similar detail of what we have downtown with the 6 feet of clear width there for pedestrians where you can put the sign, and then the area on the corner where you can't place any type of portable sign. And then Bozeman probably was the most comparable city to our size that I was able to find. They go through kind of exempt signs. So all zones, kind of the government, public utility, directional signs, incidental signs, ghost signs. That was the first time I've ever heard of a ghost sign. A ghost sign is, after I looked that up, is a sign that's on a building that the use no longer, or the company no longer exists, is what a ghost sign is. Or it could be a political sign where the candidate is no longer running for office, type of thing. And then sign on property that's for sale, rent, or for lease is exempt as well. So you can't call it a real estate sign, but you can call it a sign that's on a property that's for sale, rent, or for lease. And so it's kind of just that little, small distinction that makes it legal or doesn't. Then we go through residential zones, non-commercial temporary signs that do not exceed 9 square feet per individual sign in total area at any particular time, and if freestanding 5 feet in height. And then they give you a total sign area. So total sign area of not more than 32 square feet may be displayed at the same time. So they restrict, the total size of each individual sign, but then give you the total that you can display of the, on the entire property. And that was all I was able to find. I spent the day trying to find, I went through maybe 30, and these were the only ones that have made the change. Yeah, Boise hasn't done it, Coeur d'Alene, there's a lot of them that haven't made the change.
Are the ones in Idaho, other than you mentioned Twin Falls, not making the changes because they're already compliant, or they just haven't gotten to some kind of determination that they need to
I think they've just, I don't know what the reason is, but they're probably working on it in the future in order to amend it. As with all these decisions, there's still some ambiguity. There was the affirming decision from the justices, and in this case, I think there was 3 or 4 different opinions from the different justices about their own interpretation about what you could or could not regulate. And so there was still, I think a lot of municipalities take the approach where they'll stop kind of regulating it based upon content in their existing code, but they're going to wait and see what other, cases come out that clarify it a little bit more before they go ahead and take the time to make the change. I think is what's going on.
If we were to add the language that some of the communities have with respect to content that's compliant with the decision, and then move our code essentially to a table format, are there that many things in the code, in the Moscow code right now, that are problematic? I'm just wondering how much we really need to change here. We get the language that's compliant with the Supreme Court decision in there, put this in a table like we're moving to in the other parts, and then I guess I'm not hearing that in our code we've got a lot of problem issues that.
I think the changes are fairly simple to make to bring us into compliance. I guess the question is, we've got a lot of signage going on right now that we don't currently allow. And so, the question is whether or not we try to address that at the same time. I mean, we have real estate open house signs that are all over the place on the weekends. Right now, we only allow 1 sign per property for lease or for sale. So we don't allow any of those open house signs in the right of way. We have a lot of community event temporary signs that show up in the right of way as well. Habitat for Humanity, there's a whole host of community events. I've seen one at the intersection of the co-op for the last week. It talks about some expo. And so I guess it's just kind of those questions about, what we want to do. The non-commercial speech on every, on residential properties, we don't really address that either. We only allow commercial signage on residential properties. So if you have a home occupation, you're allowed a small commercial sign, but we don't talk about non-commercial signage that are on people's properties that you see around town. I think the trend's going up as far as, conveying some message about what you believe in, or,
Right.
things like that.
This is a religious deal, the Gilbert one, and
Well, question on that.
it was sponsored by somebody who had a belief, who had the desire to take it to the Supreme Court. Hello, it takes work to get it to the Supreme Court. You have to really want it, and it appears that, we have to pay attention to it, but I'd say cities all over America are going, we got issues to solve. We got to fix our street, and something's broken down. We got a water problem over here, and somebody's telling us to get more detailed about signs that we don't really control very well anyway. I don't want to, I wouldn't make a big deal about it, but there's a sign here and there. You could always run around town and find somebody who might have put their sign, but it doesn't bother anybody enough to go to the Supreme Court. So it just seems like it's, I can't imagine, there's all kinds of towns around Phoenix. Gilbert, just, God only knows what's going on in Gilbert.
Victoria, you had?
Yeah, so if anything, I think they need to be simpler. I'm wondering with the Gilbert one, because it dealt with the church that kept moving around, is that they didn't really care that it was a church. It's just by the nature of the beast, that happened to be what it was. And so it was the annoyance or the overdoneness of, of, of them having lots of signs because they didn't have a permanent place. I didn't get the impression they targeted it because it was religious. It just happened to be that group because they were mobile, having lots and lots and lots and lots of signs. Yeah, there's a difference. I mean, that's not targeting them for being a religion. That's just, you're overdoing it, guys.
Yeah.
Whoever you are.
Yeah.
And that was my impression of what happened there.
I'm bothered by the right-of-way restriction and the ambiguity of where the right-of-way ends on a lot of Moscow residential property. A significant part of properties it would work to simply say signs have to be behind the sidewalk. And don't worry about right-of-way boundaries.
Yeah.
We do have a fair number of lots that don't have sidewalks, and I'm not quite sure what to do there. You might say have to be behind the sidewalk or 5 feet from the curb if there's no sidewalk.
Yeah, like the one that said, yeah, if there's no sidewalk,
Yeah.
it's, maybe 5 feet from the street type
Yeah.
of thing.
But
Yeah.
don't you think our issues with signage occur mostly in business and motor business areas? I mean, do we have problems in, I don't disagree with you that we don't know where our property line is, but how many times does the issue come up in our residential areas? I think that down every street that people put up signs where the cars are, and mostly the cars don't drive on I have just about the only residential street in the city that 5,000 cars drives on. I'm particularly noteworthy that way. But you don't find, so it seems to me that most of the discussion is really about something edging toward commercial, don't you think?
Yeah.
So I don't think it's very relevant to our citizens' lives.
Yeah, and I agree that we ought to keep it as simple as possible. So, beyond making the ordinance so that it's compliant with the court cases, putting it in a table and maybe come back to us. Let's keep it as open and simple and as easy to use as possible and not create restrictions that, as you mentioned, that are almost unenforceable because we don't have people to go out. And so, if we can write it in a way that it kind of takes some of the ambiguity out, but gives people, what's wrong with having 4, 5, 6 political signs in your yard during an election cycle and then taking them out? I don't, and so we should make sure we write this in a way that doesn't confuse that and write it in a way that we're never going to enforce it anyway. So,
Contrary to what I just proposed about behind the sidewalk, I don't really think that the ones in the tree lawn are doing any great harm either.
I am inclined to agree. And, it is about visibility, and sometimes you just can't see it anyplace else. But I don't know, what kind of direction would you like from us now to move this forward?
Well, I was just, based upon the feedback, I was going to take a shot at the drafting an ordinance, and then we could bring it back and take a look at it. I
That'd be
needed
great.
to work with our city attorney on it to make sure that we were going to capture everything. But I was going to start out with what we have and just restructure it to the table format, and then, the things that we have an issue with, specifically calling out political signs and real estate signs, just restructure those to be compliant with the decision.
Okay.
And we can start with that baseline and then see how it looks and go from there.
Okay, so you'll bring it back to us at some point
Yeah, it probably won't be next meeting, but
Okay.
it'll be, yeah, at a future meeting.
Super. Okay, anybody else have questions of Mike?
So, I'm in agreement with everybody keeping it as simple as possible and as open as possible, particularly in residential areas. And I know you'll do it anyway, but like downtown, you do have, you need to have the access to get through. That's where if there's any
Yeah.
restrictions that would be tighter is, the wheelchair needs to be able to get by and that kind of thing, as a baby stroller,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. But I know you're gonna look at.
Yeah, I mean, that's where you primarily run into the complaints.
Yeah.
You know, we do have a few complaints during political season, and it's usually just for the size of the sign, not necessarily how many there are. But yeah, I mean, in commercial zones, everybody wants kind of an equal level playing field. And then you have somebody that takes it to the far extreme and displays too much signage, and then somebody else couldn't display that type of signage if they, because they asked, and then they get upset about that, and so that's, primarily part of these regulations is just to establish more of a level playing field that everybody has an opportunity to promote their business and display an equal amount of signage.
The court case was about content more than location of sign, though, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So most of the stuff you showed us tonight's about location of sign, so I'm just vaguely confused. In other words, the content thing had to have some religious aspect to it. Otherwise, we're not going to argue about whether you said gas or gasoline. Come on. So I just haven't studied the case enough, but I know it's a content thing that somebody didn't like somebody else's approach to getting to heaven, basically.
Well, but whatever language we need in the Moscow code will probably involve city attorney, and they'll come up with whatever language, and then we're going to deal with the specifics that get around the location or those kinds of issues. So, yeah, I think if you want to take a shot at putting it in table format.
Sure.
Tableizing, is that a word? So, okay, so you'll bring that back to us then when we, okay, great. All right, we're gonna move on here, fourth item. Mike, you're gonna be on again here. Review the draft ordinance eliminating the prohibition on accessory dwelling units having their own electrical service. I believe, you had a discussion about that at the last meeting, and
We did, yeah, it was, got a kind of a draft ordinance there. So as we talked about last time, we have this section within the limitations on use portion of our code that requires that accessory structures that utilize electricity or water and are accessory to a single family or duplex residence, they have to be serviced off of the single family or duplex residence. And the intent of that was to keep the likelihood of that ever turning into more of a use that's not permitted, like a commercial shop, contractor shop, could turn into a dwelling unit. It'd have a higher likelihood if it was separately metered for that to happen. And so we've always tried to control that. But after the introduction of accessory dwelling units 4 years ago, really the intent is to have a separate dwelling unit. And so we talked about this last time, and what we propose to do is go in and just add to that statement saying that accessory dwelling units are permitted to have separate meters, and then we will continue on with the section that we added after the last amendment that talks about the zoning administrator being able to authorize separate meters if there's an exceptionally long distance. Sometimes we run into the case, primarily more rural properties, that may have a shop that's a couple 100 feet away from the main house, and it's right next to an Avista power pole. And so those circumstances, I mean, it's onerous to require them to run off the main house. And we also have the issue that we've come into recently, where our electrical inspector has said that there have been a number of these where they've, been looking at having to upgrade the panel at the house, and maybe possibly the service from a 200 amp to a 400 amp service, because you have now two separate dwellings instead of a dwelling and a shop.
Right.
That you may use the shop one night a week, whereas people are living in both the dwellings, and you're pooling that power on a daily basis. So that's why we were looking at making that move. But
I think it makes sense. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
I
probably,
think- yeah, I
there's a
think
lot
it
of
does.
older homes that probably are still using screw-in fuses, which wouldn't meet any, I mean, they would have to be changed, and it's a costly process, so perfectly safe, but they wouldn't be able to add the service, so I think this makes sense.
Yeah,
Because I think most of us probably our incoming utility gets close to maxed out when you've had a house for some years.
Yep.
And then if you try and add enough for all the things that want to go in, even in a small accessory dwelling, you might have a water heater and a blah, 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 and next thing you know, it's $1,000 or $1,500 to redo
Yep.
your income. So I think it does make sense to, I think it would be we didn't talk about it when we talked about accessory dwellings, but I think it's a really a good thing, because it would discourage somebody build a little accessory dwelling and then have to, I know I just recent years put in a new service, and it's a big deal.
It's expensive. So do we need to schedule this for a public hearing then?
yeah, if everything looks good,
Yeah.
I like to go ahead and cue it up.
Is everybody,
I just
Yeah.
have one question.
Yeah.
Why not just delete that last line and just say accessory dwelling units are permitted to have separate meters, and period? Why do you need that last line?
Well, it would just still try to cover the accessory structures that aren't ADUs.
But it says the zoning administrator may allow separate meters in the event, oh, you mean outside of accessory dwelling
Yeah,
units?
Yeah.
they're two different things.
Okay,
Yeah. So that's
okay,
the
so
garage
the
or
red is
workshop.
kind of like accessory dwelling units can have separate.
Yeah, and the zoning administrator may authorize separate meters in the event, there's an exceptionally
Yeah.
long distance between the principal use and the accessory use.
I think, and the way I read it, just because it's connected, it makes that sound like that's part of the condition for the accessory dwelling unit to have a separate
Okay.
meter, but
If
that's just the way I read
yeah,
it,
if
I
that's
don't know.
confusing, I can separate it.
or instead of using, if we could, when in that last sentence where it says between the principal use and the accessory use, that does seem to tie it back to the accessory dwelling. Could we use a different word for that so that it would,
Could it be accessory structure?
yeah,
Yeah, but, which is what it is.
Or a
It is
non-dwelling
an
structure.
Accessory structure, but
What if
most
that,
people aren't gonna know
what if that sentence just goes up above the red one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it says, it talks about the
yeah.
accessory to the
Yeah.
single family or
Yeah.
duplex, the
I
zoning
think
administrator
that'd
may
help,
allow.
that'd
and then-
help, and then it doesn't seem to be hanging on, yeah.
No, that's
Yeah,
good.
we can do that.
Okay, great. So you'll go ahead and get that scheduled for public hearing then?
I will, yep.
I imagine that one will go pretty quickly, so. Okay, moving on to item 5, review the draft ordinance eliminating the covered parking space requirement for single-family and two-family dwellings.
So this was another item we talked about last time, something unique to Moscow. We have a requirement that at least one of the parking spaces, well, two if it's R1 zoning district, be required to be covered or located in an area that could be covered in the future, meaning that they would need to meet setback requirements. And we've just kind of found this to be problematic over the years, and it is unique to Moscow. People on larger development plans, if there are multiple single-family or two-family dwellings, always have to show and specify what spot's going to be covered, or could be covered in the future. And I think Nils was here last time and expressed some interest in having that removed just for his own development projects. And so that's what we do, is propose just to strike the section that talks about having a covered parking space or a future covered parking space on there. So that's what I've done, is just struck that on page 4. And then there was one other item that we ran into recently. So I've got the number of automobile parking spaces required by use table. We had an inquiry recently about indoor miniature golf. And I think before, when we were redoing the parking requirements, we had just taken, kind of duplicated, so golf courses and country clubs, if you look on page 6 there. Golf courses and country clubs, it was 4 parking spaces per hole. And then miniature golf facilities, we currently have 4 spaces per hole as well. I think that at the time we had just brought that down from the golf courses and country clubs. Thought that that was a little excessive for miniature golf facilities to have 4 per hole. I had done a little bit of research and looked through about 15 other communities, and they range between 1 and 1.5 was the typical per hole. Pending.
18 holes of miniature golf probably takes up the same space as 1 hole of.
Well, I know, yeah, really. So, so we'd like to make that change at the same time, if that,
Yep, that works.
if we're able to do that.
Okay.
Okay, so another item we can schedule for public hearing?
Yeah, and we just combine these two.
Did anybody else have any questions or comments, or, I'm glad that Nils weighed in on that one, that's good, so. Okay, moving on, we're going to defer item 6, continuing education video presentation, to the end of the meeting. So, Joel, you're up with Transportation Commission meeting report.
The Transportation Commission met on the 12th of September. There were 2 main items of discussion. One was a report dealing with some meetings of affected people by the proposed work that would be done on 3rd Street. The 2 main participants who were concerned with the parking impacts were the 1912 Center and the high school. And basically, we noted that concern and directed staff to figure out some way around to alleviate it. It's not quite clear what that might be. The second item was the discussion of A Street. And I assume you've all read in the newspapers about the A Street problem of the bid coming in well above the, currently the available money. So the commission affirmed the importance of proceeding with the A Street remodeling. And one of the proposed sources of the required money, of course, was some of the money currently allocated for 3rd Street. And with regret, we also affirmed that. And
We knew
hope
something
that the
like
city
this
will
would come up.
find ways to proceed with 3rd Street. Any comments on that?
I would say it was we appreciate the Transportation Commission giving their recommendation too, you know, when considering all the options, which really were either do it or
Yeah.
lose it potentially forever. So, and as far as the Third Street, I mean, it's, so that money is being redirected in this next year, and there's some talk about maybe something with paint at this point, and the general consensus also is
Yeah.
because, you know, it wasn't planned to be a bike and pedestrian bridge only when the initial discussions and when the Transportation Commission and the subcommittee worked on those corridor plans, that was in anticipation of the multimodal bridge. So now that that is not in existence at this point, we don't have the anticipated increase in traffic that really made that sense of urgency to do something for the bike safety. So there's time to now measure the impacts of that bridge, and I know there's some interest in maybe getting some kind of a counter system and really starting to gather some data about bike and pedestrian use and how that bridge is impacting things. And it sort of gives a little more time, and now this sort of forces the issue a bit because redirecting those funds. But I think there's still certain, well, I know there's still will continue to be interest in that whole corridor and getting some bike improvements one way or another. But the budget for the big dream right now isn't there, so it may be more of a gradual approach.
Do you think did they get a new estimate on A Street? A new estimate? I mean, A Street's been hanging around for 20 years. You know, we've been talking about it. It came up, God only knows how many years ago, and there was a lot of
Well, I think
worry,
there
howling
was
about.
some question about the estimates, but
So
I'm
it's,
not privy to that discussion.
I mean, I think I just wondered,
You know,
everything is.
everything's going up.
Everything is high these days. If you've done any work at your house
Yeah.
and hired a contractor, you just get blown away. Every contractor seems so busy, you can't even say hello to them. They're so busy. And so prices have just risen among other things. But I just wondered if A Street, if they were hanging on to an estimate that might have been several years old. And
I think part of it was the fact that a lot of what has to be done with A Street involves some of the plumbing underneath, and that may have been a cost problem.
There was also some unanticipated, uncontrollable delays in when the bids actually occurred. So the estimate was there, the bids were supposed to occur earlier than they did due to no, outside of the city's control with changes with LTAC and ITD and changes in software and all these other things. The bids, they did not put it out to bid in the time frame that was expected. And then that delay then pushes it kind of into another season, and the bids came in much higher, and that's happening. You're right. I mean, it's happening to people and engineers all over. Many cities are being surprised by their bids, and I think it's taking a little time to kind of say, okay, what is a realistic estimate at this point? And I think
and the A Street
learning
is
process.
highly used. It happens to be one of my favorite streets, so I use it a lot to go to the mall, and so I know how difficult it is, and it's got a special problems at Line Street where if you get to Line at the wrong time of day, you can smoke a cigarette while you're waiting. Yeah, it
No
can be
vaping.
amazing.
I was westbound on A Street during our rush 5 minutes, and A Street was solid with people basically all the way to the mall, and the highway was solid with people essentially to the state line.
Right.
And so far as I could tell, there was no accidents anywhere.
Right.
It was just
It
our,
does
just
make
our
you, some
first
days you
5
think,
minutes.
what do you mean we've only got 25,000 people in our town? It seems bigger.
They're all coming back from Pullman. Next planning, or next transportation meeting will be the, I think it's the 10th of October, and I have not seen an agenda yet. So,
Okay, thanks, Joel. Mike, any announcements or correspondence?
Nothing for staff.
Rob, I just have one question. Do we, you all are going to probably see the first half of the YouTube video tonight. Do we want to just have her, because we can't show it publicly apparently because of copyright issues, does everybody want to just watch the second half at home and be ready to talk about it at the next meeting, or what's your preference?
Well, I don't have the option of watching it at home. I'd rather do it here.
Why don't we, I think my preference also would be to go ahead and watch this part tonight, maybe have some preliminary discussions at the following meeting, and then our next, watch the rest of it, and we can kind of talk about, we want to watch it all through and then talk about it, or watch pieces of it and talk about it, but I think my recommendation is that we watch it together as a commission.
Get some grounding.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea too.
Okay.
'Cause
Yeah.
if I go home and watch it, I hope I wouldn't watch soccer instead.
Yeah.
Okay. No, this is a really engaging YouTube. No, you'd probably watch it. No, that's fine. I just wanted to see what people's preferences are.
So, and I appreciate you bringing up the issue, Wendy, because as we move into this, I just wanted to mention that we will be terminating the streaming part of our meeting because of the copyright issues on this video. The video that we're watching is a part of our process, the commission's process of continuing education. But the video will be available on the city's website, I believe, under the shared readings
P&Z shared
section.
readings.
So anybody that's watching us tonight can go out there and watch it separately. And Victoria?
Well, before you get to that,
Yeah.
the announcement parts, I just wanted to mention, and Brandy can weigh in if she wants, we had a PEP report, Partners for Economic Prosperity, at the council meeting where they talked about affordable housing. The one thing that stood out to me was that, and they did Palouse region, was there is an assumption that millennials don't want to own houses. And the report said millennials do want to own houses, they just need them to be affordable.
Yeah.
And so we talk about that sometimes, you know, and I thought that was really noteworthy for us.
Yeah, no, I agree. And
I think that will come out fairly strongly in I think the first half of the video that you watched, the YouTube that you watched tonight. I guess my recommendation, it's up to you, but my recommendation would be to see the second half next time and really have the discussion all folded together, because I found it hard to compartmentalize the video. You know, it just, the issues are all intertwined, and so that would be my recommendation.
Okay, why don't we plan on doing that? We'll schedule that. Do you want to do it for the October 9th meeting then, or?
Well, just if it's not a very full agenda, that would be great. It's kind of up to Mike what he thinks is going to be the case on that.
Yeah, I think we can certainly do that.
Okay, fantastic. All right, and Brandy, I appreciated at the city council meeting your comments to the consultant. That was nice to hear. Certainly makes us as a group feel like we're heading the right direction on these issues. So thank you for bringing that out. So with that, the meeting is adjourned, and if we can stay to watch, we'll do our continuing education video. And anybody that's been watching us streaming, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next meeting. So great, meeting is adjourned. Okay.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Wendy.